So welcome to our video on the Congress of Vienna. So we're starting to look at what happened to Europe after Napoleon. And so let's start off by examining our focus question. Alright, so our focus question is, how did the Congress of Vienna shape the course of European history for the 19th century? But before we can look at how it shaped Europe after the Congress of Vienna, we got to understand what was happening in Europe before the 19th century. So let's look at some preceding circumstances. European politics have been based on the feudal system for a very, very long time, hundreds of years. And in that feudal system, you had a monarch. Below the monarch, you had an aristocracy. You had a developing middle class. And at the very, very bottom, below the screen even, you had your peasants and your urban poor. Well, things had kind of changed a little bit when the French Revolution happened in 1789, and through that you saw that an absolute monarch like Louis XVI was wiped off, killed, executed by his own people, and a republic had been formed. With that republic, you had new Enlightenment ideas put in place, the idea of merit being an important determiner of political activity, and then ideas of liberty and freedom and a republic. A general will of the people governing themselves. And then you had Napoleon come in, and he took those ideas that were happening in France and he spread them out through all of Europe. In the process, and defeating countries like Spain and going through and marching through the German states, he had wreaked havoc on the political boundaries and the political landscape of Europe. And in so doing, he had unified in the Holy Alliance Prussia and Russia and Austria and England, all against France. Now, what also is important to remember is that with Napoleon, you have this new idea of liberal thinking, of nationalism, of republicanism, of his Napoleonic Code being spread into these European states that had, did not want to have these new fangled ideas in them. And so the Congress of Vienna is a reaction of what to do with Europe now that Napoleon has gone through. How do you put the pieces back together? So I know you're asking, who are the players who are going to put the pieces back together of a Europe that's been put into chaos by the French Revolution and Napoleon? Well, there are four members of the Quadruple Alliance, and those are the four main players. You got Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain. And let's start off with Austria, as they are the host nation. And their representative is Clemens von Metternich, and that's the name you need to associate the most with the Congress of Vienna. Now, Metternich, not only in hosting the balls and parties and ceremonies associated with the Congress, but also he's going to try to create the return of the legitimate monarchs that ruled before the French Revolution and before Napoleon. Out of England or Britain, you have Lord Castlereagh, and he is going to try to create a balance of power within the continental Europe. And out of Prussia, you have Karl von Hardenberg, who represents the King of Prussia, Frederick William III, and he is going to try to regain some of the land lost to Napoleon, as well as take some new territories such as Saxony. And then you have Tsar Alexander I out of Russia, and he is going to try to gain some land for himself as well, specifically Polish land. Now, you might want to say, and might ask, well, I see a fifth member on this picture right here. Who is this guy? Well, that is Talleyrand, and he is going to represent France. Now, early on, France did not have any representatives, but he kind of inserts himself, and while not being a member of the delegation, he is a mediating force, because what happens is you start to see a schism or a separation of England and Austria and Prussia and Russia as they have different goals. And he is able to manipulate the situation and get France to get back involved in power politics and power diplomacy of Europe. And so what you're looking at is you have Clemens von Metternich, you have Castlereagh, you have Hardenberg, representing Frederick William III, you have Tsar Alexander I, and then you have Talleyrand. Okay, so those are the players. Now, what did those players do? How do they put the pieces back together? And that really is what's going to lead us to our focusing question. Well, there's three main issues: legitimacy, compensation, and balance of power. So let's start off with legitimacy. And legitimacy is simply the fact that they're going to return the monarchs back in power. They're going to try to create the traditional conservative stance of European diplomacy. And so in France, they returned the Bourbons, and this means Louis XVIII. Now, Louis XVIII was Louis XVI's brother, and they returned him to power. And they returned a Bourbon to power in Spain and Naples. They returned the Pope back in power in the Papal States, as well as monarchs in Sardinia, Tuscany, Modena, and some of the other smaller states. But what they're really doing there is they're saying, we support the conservative approach to running Europe, and we are going to fight against any republicanism, liberalism, and nationalism as well. Okay? As far as compensation goes, well, different countries wanted different things. So Britain wanted to expand its empire, so it took places like Malta and Ceylon and the Cape of Good Hope, Trinidad and Tobago. Austria, while it lost some of its land, such as the Austrian Netherlands, it did gain a lot of land near it. It gains parts of Poland as well as some Italian provinces. Okay. Russia is going to come in and take most of Poland as well as Finland, and the parts of Poland it doesn't take go to Austria, and some of it goes to Prussia. Prussia gets a little bit of Poland, but mainly gets the Rhineland, which borders with France, as well as 3/5 of Saxony. And then Sweden, they also are able to take over Norway. So that's the compensation. They want to get something for what they've done. And what's going to allow is going to create these major nation states or major countries to be even more significant because they own more of the land than before. As far as balance of power goes, now this is what's really important. They wanted to make sure France or any other nation did not have the ability to just plow through Europe. And so they create around France a bunch of bigger nations or kingdoms to stop it. So they took the Austrian Netherlands, which is going to become Belgium, as well as the United Provinces, or the old Netherlands, and they combine them and create Holland. So it's a bigger nation to France's north. And then they moved Prussia to the border of France, increasing the Prussian power there. Switzerland is given perpetual, which means forever, neutrality. Okay, enjoying that to this day. Austria is involved in one of the more major significant changes from the Congress of Vienna, and that is the end of the Holy Roman Empire. So we've known the Holy Roman Empire going all the way back to King Charlemagne in the 800s. So at this point, it's been 1,000 years. Now, Austria had typically, the monarch of Austria had also, in many ways, been the Holy Roman Emperor. But the Austrian king would also serve as the president of the Diet of the German Confederation. And why it's significant is because the Holy Roman Empire had over 300 states, some of them very small and rather insignificant, but they combined many of these into 39 much larger states, with Prussia and Austria being the two kind of key players. And like I said, Austria will continually be the president of this diet. And the last piece is Piedmont Sardinia is given some of Genoa and made a little bit stronger to try to prevent France to the south. So really they're trying to put national fences of major countries around France to prevent France from expanding again. And those are the three main emphasis of the Congress of Vienna, and that is really how it's going to impact returning those monarchs from before, compensating the nations that feel they had lost something to Napoleon, and creating a balance of power within Europe. So why does it matter? How does it shape European history over the next 100 years? Well, one thing to know is that the Congress of Vienna is one of the two most important treaties that you're going to need to know in AP Euro. There's the Congress of Vienna, and then there's the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. So it has a major impact, but what is that impact? Well, the first thing it does is it creates the Concert of Europe. And what the Concert of Europe is a term used to define how the major nations, Britain, France, Prussia, Russia, Austria, have decided that it's in their best interest to work together
to maintain their own power than to fight with each other. And in that sense, they're going to go about 100 years or until World War I without having a major European conflict where all of them are involved. Okay? And if you remember in the 18th century, you had things like the 7 Years' War and the War of Austrian Succession and several other conflicts where you saw multiple nations going at each other and forming different alliances. But you're going to see that not so much in the 1800s. You do have the Crimean War, but it's not of that major, significant international conflict. Okay? And they're going to use the Congress system to try to help that. The Congress system means they're just going to come and meet whenever there are problems and issues come up. And they're going to do this for the next 8 or 9 years, starting in 1918 with Aix-la-Chapelle, where they add France into as a negotiating diplomatic partner. In 1920, in the Congress of Tripot, in which they deal with some threats to monarchical power in Spain and Italy and some Italian provinces. And in 1922, in the Congress of Verona, they decide what to do about these Latin American revolutions because Spain clearly was not able to handle those revolutions. And so France went in with their army and put down some of those revolts. Britain, on the other hand, was not too happy about that. They didn't want to see other European powers start exerting influence in the Americas. And by the way, in the following year, 1923, the United States comes out with the Monroe Doctrine saying, hey, Europe, you handle Europe, let the American countries handle America, trying to create a divide between the West and the East, Western and Eastern hemispheres. Okay, but here's the big deal. When it comes down to it, was the Congress of Vienna able to stop liberalism, stop nationalism, stop republicanism? No. I mean, look around us. Do we see the Bourbons? Do we see the Hohenzollerns? Do we see the Habsburgs? Okay. Do we see the Romanovs? And none of them are still in power. Okay. They're all democracies. They're all Republican governments now. And over the next 30 years, you're going to see revolution after revolution, and up until World War I and World War II, you're going to see these countries hanging on, these kingdoms hanging on for dear lives as the people move towards more liberal ideas and nationalistic ideas and republican ideas, and the monarchies and the conservative power, the traditional feudal elites start losing more and more of their power.